I'm Becca Franks. I'm an assistant professor of environmental studies, and I'm joined by my colleague, Jeff Sebo, who's also an assistant professor of environmental studies here at NYU. And we co-direct the NYU Wild Animal Welfare Program, the sponsor of today's event. At the Wild Animal Welfare Program, we work to advance our understanding about wild animals, what they are like, how humans and wild animals interact, and how humans can improve our interactions with them across scale, from the dyadic all the way up through the regional, national, and global scales. We pursue these goals through foundational research in the humanities and social sciences and natural sciences, as well as through our outreach to academics, advocates, policymakers, and the general public. Today, we're very lucky to hear from Natalie Jacewicz, assistant professor of environmental law at the University of San Diego School of Law, who will be talking about her recent work incorporating individual animal well-being into wildlife management. Before I fully introduce the speaker, our speaker today, please note that after her lecture, we will have a Q&A session led by Jeff. And that's always a great opportunity to have a lively discussion, and we want to involve you, the audience. So you should be able to see at the bottom of your Zoom screen a Q&A button where you can enter questions directly into that Q&A tab. And if you enter it there, so don't enter it in the chat, that won't be visible to everyone. But if you enter your questions in the Q&A tab, the entire audience can see those questions, and then you can upvote the questions that you're also having or find to be interesting and really want to hear. So that can really create a nice dynamic engagement with our audience. So please just add those questions throughout the lecture as they occur to you. And so it's with great pleasure that I present Professor Jacewicz. Her recent scholarship has focused on the intersection of environmental law, administrative law, and animal welfare. Prior to entering academia, Professor Jacewicz was a Furman Fellow at the NYU School of Law and the Legal Fellow at the Institute for Policy Integrity. She clerked for the Honorable Judge Moss of the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia, and the Honorable Judge Tatel at the DC Circuit. Professor Jacewicz holds a JD from NYU, a science journalism degree from the University of California, Santa Cruz, and a bachelor's degree in evolutionary biology from Harvard, where she spent most of her time thinking about lizards, which just sounds great. Maybe we can discuss that in the Q&A. Her talk today grapples with the important and thorny problem of whether and how animals' interests matter in environmental law. Thank you all for being here, and please join me in welcoming Professor Jacewicz.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much for having me, and a particular thanks to Jeff, Becca, and Sophia for organizing this event. I'm a big fangirl of the Wild Animal Welfare Program, so it's a treat to be featured. Okay, I'm now going to see if I can share my slides. Here we go. And because I'm based in San Diego, we're probably going to have the sun sort of playing light on my face throughout. It's a hard problem, but one we have to deal with here. Okay, so my talk is going to be about incorporating individual animal well-being into wildlife management. And what that gets at is what the core goal of conservation law should be. That is, what in nature merits protection and why. Now, I bet if we surveyed Americans or even folks on this Zoom about what in nature merits protection and why, we get a wide range of answers. Some people might focus on protecting natural commodities, sustainably harvesting them, such as timber or fisheries for economic reasons. Others might emphasize the importance of preserving pristine ecosystems and landscapes for cultural, recreational, or aesthetic purposes. And still others might focus on protecting endangered species, biodiversity, the rich array of species that populate our planet, perhaps for scientific reasons or for moral ones. And we see these values reflected in the environmental statutes of American law, more particularly conservation law. And by that, I just mean the types of environmental law that tend to focus on protecting things in nature or animals in nature, not as much pollution. So that's what I mean when I talk about conservation law. And here are just a few examples. So the Migratory Bird Treaty Act was passed in 1918 to protect the supply of migratory birds, which were being overhunted for a variety of reasons, including adorning ladies' hats. And that law prohibits killing, hunting, or selling any migratory birds, sort of viewing birds, for example, as a kind of commodity. Then the National Park Service Organic Act requires the Park Service to conserve the scenery, natural and historic objects, and wildlife in the park so as to leave those resources unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. That's for ecosystems, kind of landscape sort of management. And as to species, the Endangered Species Act requires agencies to use all methods and procedures which are necessary to bring any endangered species or threatened species to the point of recovery. Now, these conservation approaches differ in important ways, but they share a focus on protecting ecological collectives like species or ecosystems. What conservation hasn't traditionally cared so much about is protecting individual animals for their own sake. So if an animal belongs to an abundant population, you can kill it in whatever manner you choose, and that doesn't raise conservation alarms. And those very same conservation statutes that we were just talking about reflect this. So the Migratory Bird Treaty Act protects migratory birds, but it allows hunting after the Fish and Wildlife Service has considered the bird's abundance, their distribution, and their economic value. And it doesn't include any kind of requirement for humaneness in deciding on a method of killing these birds if a permit is issued. Similarly, for ecosystems and landscapes, the National Park Service says that the statutory act for that service says that the park may provide for the destruction of such animals and plant life as may be detrimental to the use of any park. And again, there's no humaneness requirement. And the Endangered Species Act just doesn't say anything about abundant animals because, as the name suggests, the act is focused on protecting members of rare species. This focus on collectives stands in contrast with the emphasis of the animal advocacy movement, which gained momentum in the late 1970s. It really got cooking after Peter Singer published Animal Liberation. And the key insight that I want you all to take away from this is that most animals, or many, if not most animals, are sentient. That is, they can feel pleasure and pain, and that limits morally how we can treat them. So this has led to a kind of tension or dispute between animal advocates on the one hand and conservationists on the other hand, which in the United States have come to a head in something called removal decisions. So every year, agencies, probably some that you've heard of, like the Bureau of Land Management, the Fish and Wildlife Service, NOAA Fisheries, removes, that is to say, captures or kills large numbers of wild animals en masse to protect endangered species or threatened ecosystems. Animal advocates then tend to sue because they view these removals as cruel to the animals that are being captured or killed. And that tension is going to motivate the rest of this talk. All right, so here's the plan for the rest of this talk. I'm going to divide it into 4 parts. The first is just going to be introducing this tension between traditional conservation and the animal advocacy movement. And I'm going to rely on charismatic sea lions as an example of this tension. And I'm also going to explain briefly why I think it makes more sense to think of American law in the conservation context as conflicted about whether individual animal well-being matters, as opposed to irreconcilably hostile to considering individual animal well-being. So I'll briefly describe that. And the upshot is that these laws leave agencies like the Bureau of Land Management and the Fish and Wildlife Service a lot of discretion about how to think about individual wild animals and whether to conduct these kinds of removals. So Part two, we'll look at how agencies are thinking about these kinds of removal decisions and thinking about individual animals. I did a deep dive into a lot of these analyses where agencies explain how they're thinking about these actions. So I'll summarize what I found from that. I was surprised to find that agencies actually are thinking about individual animal well-being, but they're doing so in ways that are inconsistent, ad hoc, both across agencies, across species, and even sometimes within a single decision. So in part three, I'm going to argue that the status quo could use some improvement, and I'll suggest that there are some sort of long-term approaches or frameworks that we can use to start thinking about how to value individual animal well-being when making wildlife management decisions. That's ultimately going to be a long-term project that involves lots of disciplines. So lawyers, yes, but scientists, philosophers. I mean, it's really a thorny problem that's going to take expertise from a lot of different sides. So I'll also just suggest then some kind of near-term solutions that I think could improve on the status quo and would be pretty easy to implement. And then finally, I'm just going to briefly gesture to new frontiers in individual wildlife management that I think are interesting and that I'm kind of thinking through right now. All right. So part one. All right, this is about the Columbia River Basin, which is in the Pacific Northwest in the United States. That's home to two different species of sea lions. On the left, we have California sea lions. On the right, we have Steller sea lions. And both of these sea lions eat a lot of fish to survive. Specifically, they eat a lot of endangered salmon. And that creates a problem for NOAA Fisheries, the agency that is tasked with protecting a lot of marine and water life, because NOAA Fisheries, under the Endangered Species Act, is supposed to prevent the extinction of threatened salmon, such as the ones that the sea lions are eating. On the other hand, NOAA Fisheries also, under the Marine Mammal Protection Act, is supposed to avoid killing, harassing, or otherwise harming marine mammals, which sea lions are. What to do? Well, as is typical of a lot of these conservation laws, the Marine Mammal Protection Act has a carve-out which says, once these animals become abundant, you are allowed to remove them, manage them, or disperse them if they are eating endangered fish. So in the early 2000s, NOAA Fisheries, Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and the US Army Corps of Engineers, which helps with conservation management around dams, began a number of non-lethal so-called hazing methods to get the sea lions to leave the Columbia River Basin. Their techniques were legion. They chased the sea lions in boats, they branded the sea lions to keep track of them, shot them with rubber bullets, used seal bombs, which are underwater explosives. In one instance, they built $1 million physical barrier to keep sea lions from passing up the river through this dam, but to allow the fish to pass through. And my personal favorite, they deployed this fake fiberglass orca whale in the state of Washington, which a person can climb inside and can steer, and supposedly it also spouts water and makes some orca type noises. But none of these techniques were particularly successful. After dispersing sea lions, they would always return. The orca promptly capsized. That is it there floating in front of some pretty unimpressed looking sea lions. There's a guy emerging from the orca. I think his face speaks volumes. And that $1 million barrier that I mentioned, well, the sea lions just, climbed up it pretty quickly. They were able to navigate it. So in 2008, NOAA Fisheries began to approve lethal removal of sea lions. And the way this works, these are some traps here. The sea lions get out, they haul out onto these floating traps to rest. These trap doors fall, and then they are transported by barge and then killed, usually via lethal injection. So this is far from unique. Every year, federal agencies capture or kill thousands of wild animals, and we're not even talking about animals they've deemed invasive necessarily. This is even just limited to animals we agree uh, belong here, but nonetheless, the agency decides that there are too many of them because they're threatening another species that's endangered or in some way harming the ecosystem. So it's pretty common for environmental progress to be made on the back of significant harm to large numbers of individual animals. Now, you might think, because of that, that our laws require these kinds of removals, but that's actually not quite right. It's more accurate to say that a lot of American conservation law either just doesn't say anything one way or another about individual animal well-being. So a good example of that is the Endangered Species Act. Just doesn't say anything about whether we need to care about individual animal well-being as something of inherent value. And then there are laws that are a little more conflicted. So the Marine Mammal Protection Act is a good example of this. It was passed in 1972 to maintain marine mammal species at optimum sustainable population level through a ban on importing, harassing, hunting, capturing, or killing marine mammals. And if you look at the legislative history, you can see that there are sort of conflicting views motivating legislators to pass this law. So the Senate report takes it, I would say, a kind of more traditional conservation type approach, says man's dealings with marine mammals have resulted in overutilization of this precious resource. That says it's necessary to act to ensure that future generations would be able to enjoy a world populated by all species of marine mammals. But the House of Representatives language, I think, speaks much more to a kind of interest in the inherent value of individual animals. So it says that the humans had committed a, quote, virtual genocide on marine mammals, which had been, quote, shot, blown up, clubbed to death, run down by boats, poisoned, and exposed to a multitude of indignities. And the House expressly rejects in its report the view that marine mammals' principal significance lies in their usefulness to man. So it's much more of a kind of what I have been presenting as a sort of animal advocacy type of emphasis on the individual animal's well-being. And the statute that was eventually passed has traces of both ways of thinking about marine mammals. So as I already noted, the statute, for example, allows harming sea lions if they pose threats to rarer types of animals. That's a very kind of resource-based, collective-based way of thinking about whether animals have value. But on the other hand, the statute includes several kinds of safeguards and protections about how the agency is allowed to let these animals be removed. So there's a sort of burden of proof in a lot of situations where the sea lion has to be individually identified as the particular sea lion that's feeding on the salmon. And in 2018, they introduced language to the statute requiring humane killing methods, specifically the least possible degree of pain and suffering practicable, and in the context of sea lions, primarily using humane chemical methods for killing the sea lions. So even when the animals are abundant, the statute doesn't completely abandon them. It does include some protections, suggesting that their value in the statute's eyes is beyond simply being part of a rare population. The upshot here, though I don't have time to go through all of the different conservation statutes, is that conservation law is kind of a mishmash of values and leaves a lot of discretion to the wildlife managers in these agencies to determine whether and how to remove wild animals. And when these removals happen, they generate a significant pushback from animal advocates who view the removals as cruel. So I just have here, some of the types of groups you might see suing and some of the agencies you might see being sued. I tried to look at as many of these cases as I could between 2000 and 2022 and found 66 cases suing over these removal decisions. The animal advocates are sometimes successful in stopping the decisions. However, usually they're having to argue in kind of traditional environmental and conservation terms. So they might argue, for example, that the Bureau of Land Management has not adequately proven that wild horses are in fact overgrazing on public land. Therefore, they haven't adequately proven that they should be removing the wild horses. What they're usually not arguing is that wild horses have some kind of inherent value and it's wrong for us to treat them in a particular way. So here the takeaway is just that courts have not said that agencies are required to think about individual animal well-being. It hasn't really been an issue that's been presented to the courts, which again just leaves a lot of this discretion to agencies. All right, part two. So given that agencies have all of this discretion, it's really important to understand how they're thinking through wild animal well-being as individuals contra thinking through them as collectives. And I wanted to figure out how they were thinking about this, if at all. So I submitted Freedom of Information Act requests to a lot of these different agencies. I also looked at governmental archives online. And between 2002 and 2022, I was able to come up with 105 of these documents called environmental analyses. And that's just where agencies have to explain their reasoning for why they are taking a given action that will affect the environment in a meaningful way. And in this case, the action is these removal decisions of killing or capturing animals. And the agency is just kind of explaining what they think the effects will be, why they think this action is necessary. And the headline takeaway, which I'll break down in a moment, is that I was surprised to find that agencies actually are thinking to some degree about individual animal well-being. To be honest, I kind of expected that they would just be focused on collectives and populations, and that would be why we're seeing so many removals. But in fact, the agencies are taking individual animal well-being into account, but they're just doing so in ad hoc ways that don't always make a lot of sense. So with that, I'll tell you a little bit more specifically about what I found. The first thing, and this was really common across the analyses that I looked at, the large majority of analyses seek to avoid causing suffering to any abundant animals being removed. So this is a quote from the Fish and Wildlife Service, which in 2021 decided to kill cougars to reduce predation on bighorn sheep in Oregon. And so their decision document said, individual cougars would be directly affected by the process of lethal removal. If they were tracked and chased by hounds, they would undergo stress from fear during the chase and subsequent cornering. If they were captured in a box trap, they would also be stressed at least during the initial hours of capture as they attempted to escape. If they were captured by a foothold trap, they would experience stress from fear, pain from the trap, and possible injury from attempts to escape. In all these cases, they would likely experience additional stress as the human approached them before being dispatched by a carefully aimed lethal gunshot. And then it goes on to say, what I have here on the slide, there is no practical field method of lethal removal that would avoid some degree of stress and pain experienced by the targeted cougar. But the service seeks to minimize both by deploying only experienced personnel committed to ethical and humane practices, and by prioritizing methods that minimize cougar pain and suffering. So this is really common, as I said, this is maybe one of the more detailed discussions of what is owed cougars or how important it is to ensure that a cougar is treated humanely. But some interest in humaneness was something that was really common throughout these analyses. However, it's not completely consistent. For one thing, every so often you find a removal decision where the agency just seems to completely neglect humaneness. So I have up here a picture of a Galapagos shark, which NOAA Fisheries in 2009 decided to remove a number of to reduce predation on endangered monk seal pups. And there's just not any discussion of humaneness in that analysis, even though they're killing these sharks, and some of the methods seemed as though they would be pretty painful. So that's one source of inconsistency. Another I'll note is that even within a given agency, the strength of the commitment to humaneness varies. So The Fish and Wildlife Service, starting in 2013, began allowing the shooting of barred owls to reduce competition with northern spotted owls, which are endangered in the Pacific Northwest. And as part of that decision, the agency lays out all of these very specific criteria that have to be satisfied. So, the agency has to use a certain type of, someone's shooting has to be qualified, has to use a certain type of gun, can't be more than a certain distance away. They have to put out a call for a northern spotted owl first and make sure nothing's around. And if you're unable to get a clean shot or have access to a clean shot, you can't take the shot. It's really hard, rigid humaneness requirements. By contrast, as you just saw in the cougar context, the agency says, look, we're going to prioritize more humane methods if we can. We'd love to shoot the cougar quickly and as humanely as possible. But, if we need to use one of these less humane methods, for example, trapping the cougars, so be it. Regrettable, but it is part of what we'll do. And then the Fish and Wildlife Service also shoots double-crested cormorants, again in the Pacific Northwest, to reduce predation on endangered salmon. And there it just endorses a slew of different ways of killing. So it says it includes shooting, cervical dislocation, carbon dioxide asphyxiation, or other methods recommended by the American Veterinary Medical Association. It seems unlikely that all of these methods are equally humane, but the agency declines to differentiate from them in any way. So already we're seeing like a bit of inconsistency across these decisions. Okay, second, agencies frequently seek to minimize the number of animals removed, and often this is justified in an implicit or express assumption that wild animal lives are worth living and worth preserving if you can in the wild. So, I mean, this varies. One piece of evidence for this is that a lot of agencies will engage in time-consuming hazing techniques to try to disperse animals before relying upon lethal methods. So in the case of sea lions, as we already talked about, but also in the case of double-crested cormorants, this is done. And the Park Service has sought to reduce deer killings by choosing management alternatives that combine sharpshooting with vaccinating 90% of does with contraceptives once such contraceptives become available. And that's a big asterisk because the service claims that such contraceptives are not currently available. But the service says, and I have a quote here from one of its analyses in 2015, that part of why it's interested in contraceptives is that the method has gained more attention as the public has become more interested in wildlife management decisions. So just this interest in minimizing the number of animals killed. And then the most extreme version of this is the Bureau of Land Management, which just in some cases refuses to follow a statutory mandate to kill healthy animals. So under the Wild Free Roaming Horses and Burros Act, the Bureau of Land Management is supposed to protect wild horses on public lands in the West, but if these horses reach excess levels, the agency is expected to remove the horses, and that is by statute supposed to be a combination of killing horses and putting them up for adoption. And for much of the statute's life, it has not received funding to kill healthy horses. Congress, notwithstanding the fact that Congress passed this law, has not had the stomach to fund killing healthy horses. But for a little while it did in the early 2000s. And the Bureau of Land Management just flat out refused to do it. And it said that it was concerned about the public and congressional reaction to the large-scale slaughter of thousands of healthy horses. So instead, it tends to rely on fertility controls. It darts horses with fertility, anti-fertility vaccines, contraceptive vaccines. Less commonly is interested in spaying or gelding the horses and gives IUDs to female horses. So rounds up these horses with helicopters, gives them IUDs to prevent reproduction. Agencies also seek to minimize stressful interventions. And a colorful example of this is in the context, again, of the Fish and Wildlife Service deciding whether to kill barred owls to reduce competition with northern spotted owls. It took the unprecedented step of convening a stakeholder group led by a professional ethicist. And the whole point of this group was to talk about the owl debacle aiming to do, quote, everything possible to prevent owls from experiencing physical or other suffering, incorporating, quote, the values of compassion and avoidance of suffering, a focus on the well-being of owls themselves, and resisting management solutions that would too easily support lethal removals without sufficient reason and reflection. Then the group talked about what was owed both kinds of owls by people, and it toyed with the idea of non-lethal techniques of, say, like relocating the owls to other locations, and it decided that that would be too stressful. The participants determined that this to be arguably no better than lethal removal in many cases, and the method was likely to be inhumane as well due to pain and suffering. So here again, there's this interest in individual animal well-being, but it manifests here as a determination that's actually more humane to quickly kill an animal than to non-lethally control it in a way that would be stressful. And so I'll note that either of these positions might make sense, but they are in some tension with each other, and the agencies don't usually explain why in one circumstance quick death is preferable, and in another circumstance stressful non-lethal management is preferable. They just kind of take one or take the other and don't seem to really engage too much with why in the past they've gone a different way or why a different agency takes a different approach. So just want to throw out that, again, that's kind of the source of tension within these decisions, or a source of inconsistency, at least, that goes unexplained. All right, and the fourth one is a little different. It's the last one I'll talk about, which is that up to now I've been talking about the agency as recognizing certain negative duties to animals. So you're not supposed to make the animal suffer too much. You're not supposed to kill the animal if you can avoid it. But in a limited number of circumstances, agencies, in fact, acknowledge a positive duty to wild animals. So a certain obligation to intervene on the animal's behalf. And that is particularly in the case of the Bureau of Land Management or the Forest Service when it comes to managing wild horses. And they claim that they are removing wild horses not only to protect the land, but often because it is actually the humane thing to do. It is in the horse's interest. So this usually, the way this logic works is that these horses are really abundant, they're in large numbers, and the agency says that it's worried that if the horses continue in such large numbers, they will not have adequate food or water to survive. So as the quote on the screen suggests, the agency will often say, while some members of the public have advocated letting nature take its course, allowing horses to die of dehydration and starvation would be inhumane treatment. And then I'll go on to just include a little more language that is really common across these analyses about horses. As the vegetative and water resources are overutilized and degraded to the point of no recovery as a result of the wild horse overpopulation, wild horses would start showing signs of malnutrition and starvation. The weaker animals, generally the older animals, and the mares and foals would be the first to be impacted. It is likely that a majority of these animals would die from starvation and dehydration. Now, you might think that it's right or wrong to think that we owe animals in difficult ecological conditions an obligation to intervene on their behalf or help them in some way. I could see it being plausibly argued in either direction. But again, what's interesting here is that the agency, this is sort of very specific to the wild horse context, and agencies don't seem to extend this kind of concern to other animals that are at abundance. You don't hear agencies worrying that sea lions, for example, are going to be suffering because there are so many of them competing for the same fish, and therefore it would be a good idea to remove some of them. This is something that you really see in the horse context. Occasionally you'll see the National Park Service saying something similar for white-tailed deer or bison, that it will help those animals to kill them because that's a better death than a death competing for resources. But those the National Park Service never claims that it would have an obligation to intervene if the conditions became really difficult for those animals. It just kind of mentions it as a possible benefit of acting. Here, the Bureau of Land Management and the Forest Service are pretty strong about the idea that they would have an obligation to intervene. So that's kind of the last way that I think is really interesting, that agencies tend to think about individual wild animals. Okay, so I think that this is not a great way of going about managing wild animals. And I'll just throw out a couple, I mean, I guess not a couple, a few reasons why I think that that's the case. So one, it thwarts policy goals. If agencies care about individual animal well-being, as it suggests they do to some degree, if you read these reasoning and decision-making documents, the fact that an agency is forgetting or neglecting certain types of harm or certain types of species is going to thwart the agency's ability to think about individual wild animals and what benefits or harms them in a productive way. And could also shut down agencies' ability to think creatively about certain policy solutions. So in some circumstances, you see these little bursts of creativity from agencies. For example, in 2005, the Fish and Wildlife Service ended up declining to, or sorry, rather, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers ended up not killing Caspian terns, but relocating them to reduce predation on endangered fish. Similarly, a few years after killing many Galapagos sharks, NOAA Fisheries actually decided it made more sense to just relocate endangered seal pups to an area where there was less predation, and desisted from killing the sharks as a means of protecting the seals. So if an agency thinks more consistently about individual animal well-being as it's making its decisions, then it can really understand the costs and benefits of these kinds of removal decisions, and recognizing the costs could lead the agency to engage in more creative, innovative thinking beyond just a kind of gut reaction to kill a bunch of abundant animals. Second, the agency's current approach exacerbates conflicts with animal advocates because often agencies fail to put certain parts of their actions in animal well-being terms. So, for example, you could imagine a world where the agency justified the removal of sea lions by talking not only about the benefits to the species of salmon protected, but by talking about the welfare of individual salmon and saying something like salmon, probably suffer when sea lions prey upon them. And so it'll be a better world for the salmon if we remove the sea lions. But the agency doesn't tend to talk in those terms. Most animals don't come in for any kind of treatment as valuable at the individual level, other than the animals being removed. And so I don't think that this is going to eliminate any kinds of disputes between agencies and animal advocates. I'm sure that there will continue to be disagreement, but the agency were a little more systematic about saying the effects of some of these removals could be positive for animals, and that might at least get animal advocates a little closer or shrink the gap between these two groups, and then they can maybe have a more productive conversation about why animal advocates disagree or agree, etc. Next, I just think that this kind of inconsistency undermines governmental legitimacy. This is a popular one for lawyers to talk about, and it's basically the idea that we think that people trust and respect the government partly because we expect the government to treat similar situations alike, like situations alike. And when the government doesn't do that, it seems kind of arbitrary and maybe like an entity that we shouldn't respect as much. So that's a problem. And then finally, this inconsistency within decisions could expose agencies to legal risk. So if an agency isn't thinking about individual animals as valuable when they're deciding whether to remove animals in the first place, and are only thinking about the value of individual wild animals when thinking about how to remove them or the method of removing them, it's a kind of inconsistent way of looking at wild animals within a decision. And agencies are required to be rational in their decision making, or courts will strike down their decisions. So I think that in some ways, these logical failings actually could make it likelier that agencies will have more of their decisions struck down in court if animal advocates challenge them on these terms. Okay, then what are some possible better ways of thinking through how we should think about wild animals? Well, I'm not going to solve them all today, but I'm going to just rely on a few kind of prevalent philosophical frameworks and talk through a little bit about the pros and cons of how these different frameworks might work in thinking about removals. So one possible way of thinking about this would be non-anthropic utilitarianism. And under this approach, the goal would be to maximize net welfare across society, critically, not only for humans, but also for non-human animals. And so the way this would work, I guess, is if you are thinking about a removal decision, you would think about the effects, the benefits of killing or capturing the animals, to the other animals in the community, to humans, etc. And then on the other hand, you would think about the costs, certainly to the animals being removed, but maybe other costs associated with the enforcement of the action or the upset that it causes humans to know about these animals being removed. Anyway, you just kind of throw it all into the sort of pro and con consideration. And then depending if the pros outweighed the cons, you would move forward with the action. And if they didn't outweigh the cons, then you wouldn't. Big deal here is just that you are incorporating individual animals' value or the perspective of the animals in this decision making. Now, the nice thing about this approach is that already the government does this a lot in other environmental regulations. Very common to these kind of cost benefit analyses. And here you would just have to kind of pop another value, another consideration, animal welfare into the analysis. But the con is that it could require a lot of intervention because arguably there's a lot more intervention we should be doing if we're really trying to maximize net benefit. There might be all kinds of animals that we could remove and therefore help the rest of the animal community. So it could be pretty expensive. It might be might entail more work than we like to think of doing when it comes to managing nature. Another possible approach is more of a rights-based approach. And people who recognize animal rights tend to frame these rights in different ways, but a pretty consistent one is to recognize that animals, at the very least, have a right to avoid being killed or injured. And often in the wildlife context, this kind of reduces to just leaving wildlife alone, not intervening. So an obvious pro of that is that it's pretty easy to do. It doesn't require a lot of resources on the part of the agency to just leave animals alone. But the critique is that we've already altered these landscapes and ecosystems a lot through climate change and habitat degradation. Does it really make sense for us then to abandon the animals to this world that we've bestowed upon them? And then it's also in tension with some statutes because there are some conservation statutes that expressly allow killing animals. So we might have to change those statutes if we want to acknowledge a general right of wild animals to be free from being killed or harmed by humans. And if we don't, then there is a sort of awkward double think dance that we would be asking the government to do, where sometimes the animals have rights, sometimes they don't, etc. Another possibility is Martha Nussbaum's capabilities approach. So this is just the idea that sentient animals are entitled to both be free from certain kinds of invasions of their bodily integrity, but also have access to opportunities and materials that allow them to flourish. This has the pro of perhaps kind of being a little less intervention inclined than a utilitarian approach. There would probably be a presumption against removing wild animals. On the other hand, it would be a little more amenable to intervening sometimes to help animals at a large scale than the rights-based approach might typically be. But then the con is the flip side of those things. So it still might be pretty resource intensive if we are doing these kind of interventions to help animals. And it would also be in some tension with statutes for the same reason that a rights-based approach would be. So none of these frameworks are totally perfect, or at least they all have their challenges. But they're helpful to kind of think through different possibilities of starting to tackle this problem. All right, in the near term, what do I think we should do? I fortunately think that there are some things we could just kind of quickly do to make the status quo a little bit better. So one is that I think that agencies in these decisions that they make should just try to discuss the effects to individuals and populations separately. Because right now, agencies are often discussing them in the same section of their decision, and they therefore are conflating the effect on population and the effect on individual animals. So it's very common for an agency to say, this removing these deer will have no effect on the deer. Killing these deer will have no effect on the deer. And of course, what the agency really means is, well, there will still be a healthy deer population, but by saying that, they're ignoring this effect of the harming and suffering that might be visited upon the deer in killing them. So there are a few examples of agencies distinguishing between effects on populations and effects on the individual animals. The cougar example from earlier is such an example. So in talking about the population, the Fish and Wildlife Service said there would be a short and long-term negligible effect on the regional cougar population. So really no effect at the population level that is concerning to the agency. But then it goes into how individual cougars would be directly affected by lethal removal, and it talks about those kinds of effects that we already discussed. And that's just a helpful way of separating out these issues to make sure that effects on individual wild animals are not completely neglected. And then another example would be to consider individual animal well-being in determining whether to remove in the first place. So a decent example of this, it was rare, but in the context of removing barred owls, convening the stakeholder group that kind of grapples with these issues at the front end, determining whether we're going to kill the animals in the first place, as opposed to doing some other kind of intervention. It's really helpful, I think, to just think about the animals as individual animals from the beginning of your decision. Don't wait until you've already committed to killing or capturing the animals to only think about their value as individuals at the end. There's no reason to cabin the decision in that way, and it's sort of illogical and could open you up to legal challenges. As the owl example illustrates, there still might be circumstances where even after thinking about the individual animal's well-being, it's decided that it still makes sense to kill a lot of these animals. But at least then everyone's on the same page about this being a tragic outcome, an undesirable one. There might be more interest in funding research or thinking about alternatives. So that's my second recommendation. And then my third is to discuss individual animal well-being of animals other than those removed. So don't just think about the effects to well-being of the horses that you're removing, but also think about the effects of death or the effects of removal on other animals, for better or for worse. Agencies very infrequently do this today, but I have included here a quote from Bureau of Land Management in one of its analyses. It talks about how wild horses can be aggressive around water sources, so some wildlife may not be able to compete, which could lead to the death of individual animals. Therefore, removing the horses would presumably help some of those animals. Just think that agencies should talk about those kinds of effects more broadly when they can. And just the final part here, part 4, is just a nod to something interesting that I think is happening, which is that so far I've been talking about individual animals as being, more or less fungible within a species. So, been talking about thinking about an individual deer as sort of a representative of what a typical deer would like or not like, and managing all deer within a community in a similar way. I haven't been talking so much about finer grained distinctions where you might manage one deer that eats one type of plant, for example, that you're trying to protect, differently from another type of deer that just eats grass. There's reason for this because traditionally it would have been a pipe dream to think about managing individual wild animals differently because it would be so difficult to keep track of the different behaviors of particular wild animals or their personality differences. But increasingly it is becoming more and more possible to actually track individual animals as distinct from one another, even within a population, and to think about managing them differently. And the interest in this kind of comes from all different kinds of directions. So, the Bureau of Land Management, in one of its analyses, talked about interest in creating a Facebook for wild burrows, where you sort of have the picture of the burrow and some information about burrow's, I guess, parents, its health, its age. And so whenever you're on the range, a wildlife manager would know a particular burrow and I suppose be able to make informed management decisions about that burrow. And more generally, there's been a lot of interest in just tracking animals more and a real revolution in this technology. So now you can have tags that are the size, weight of a raindrop. So you don't only track really large migratory animals, but you can track birds, insects, and collect all this data from them, heart rate, location, temperature, and just know a lot more about what any given individual wild animal is doing at a particular point in time. So that opens up this idea of managing individual wild animals differently and maybe, I don't know, punishing problem wild animals, which might be concerning. On the other hand, it might allow us to spare more wild animals or have kind of more targeted interventions. So I'm really interested in thinking about the situations in which this might be a good thing or a bad thing, concerning or not. I'm interviewing agency wildlife officials right now to try to learn about how they're using this technology. So far, it seems it's not so much for individualized management as for just understanding more about where, as a general matter, a particular species of bird tends to fly, or where, as a general matter, elk tend to go. But the potential is there, and certainly from some quarters, interest is there in generating some kind of specialized approach to managing particular individual wild animals differently from their population. So that's something I'm thinking about. Happy to talk about that if any of you have examples or questions about it. And with that, thank you for your time.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Natalie, for that fantastic talk and for all of your research too. This is really, really, really helpful. And we have a ton of questions and comments in the chat, so we will try to get through as many of them as possible. And everybody, please keep in mind, you can enter your questions in the Q&A tab. You can also upvote and comment on questions. We will try to get to as many of them as possible, but whether or not we get to it, we will send them to Natalie so she can at least see them afterwards without, of course, expectation of a response following the event. But just know that your question will be seen no matter what. So we can start with what is presently the most upvoted question, which is about how seriously to take an apparent commitment to humane treatment of animals. So Kristen asks, in regards to policy language that stresses humane treatment of animals, how much do you think this is just to reduce public outcry or help the agency complete the goal of removing the animals, as opposed to an expression of a genuine attempt to be humane and ethical?
That's a great question, and I just want to bite the bullet initially and say that I can only give you so much based on what I've read, and so I can't with complete confidence say which drivers are causing agencies to talk more about humaneness and how much of it is a real commitment in the heart and soul of agency managers to being humane and how much of it is about public outcry. But I mean, I'll posit that I think it's probably a bit of both. The agencies, in some cases, are quite explicit about the fact that part of why they're talking about being humane or using contraceptives is that they are they are aware that the public cares about this and that they've gotten pushback about using other kinds of methods. On the other hand, I think it would be a mistake to think that this is completely pretextual on the part of agencies and they don't care at all, because I think a lot of wildlife managers get into this because they like animals, and that's of course somewhat distinct from saying that they always have the interests of every given particular animal at heart. But on anecdotally, some of the wildlife managers I've talked to, like I talked with one who was an ornithologist who was then having to shoot barred owls, and he was pretty tortured about it. He kind of said, look, I'm going to need a lot of therapy after this because it feels like just the totally wrong thing to do. Even though I guess, at some higher level, he thought it was the right thing to do. So I'm interested in learning more about what's driving this, but the short answer is I'm guessing it's a bit of both.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I'm also going to consolidate some questions and comments when they are on a similar theme. So another quite upvoted and very good question from Emily, which relates to another question asked below by Kristen, involves values. So the version of the question that Kristen asks is, obviously there are values at play here. You mentioned utilitarianism and rights and the capabilities approach. And we need some mechanism for deciding which values to select and how much weight to give them and how they compare to various other considerations. And then the version of the question that Emily asks is also about how do we keep ourselves in check when we are projecting our values out onto wild animal populations? How can we tell the difference, for example, between ethical management of wild animal populations versus the next form of colonialism and imperialism, projection, imposition of values, thinking we know best and making a mess of everything. So when is it care and when is it hubris? And how can you tell the difference? So yeah, anything you can say to those sorts of questions would be great.
Yeah, I mean, these are great questions that that are deep, and I probably won't be able to give fully satisfactory answers, but I will say that as far as the concern about hubris and the kind of almost a new type of colonialism, I do think that that is one of the reasons people sometimes promote the rights based leave it alone approach, because that does seem to run less of a risk of violating that particular type of concern than some of the other approaches that I briefly discussed that involve more intervention, albeit call it well-meaning intervention. I mean, you could also say, and sometimes I could easily imagine an agency going this way, but they're not talking about it this way now, saying something like, look, we care about individual animal well-being. However, it is beyond our current capability to think about the well-being of each individual squirrel and salamander and toad in this forest. We just don't have the technological capability to think about that right now, let alone the ethical ability to weigh these different concerns. So we are just going to use, say, ecosystem health as a kind of proxy for the well-being of all these animals in a community. And then maybe kind of, often that's probably going to militate toward just trying to leave the system alone. Sometimes it might not, as in some of these instances, but I think putting it that way would be helpful, and it's something that the agency's not currently doing. They're not choosing to talk about this at all. As how would this affect the individual thriving of wild animals in the community? And so that's a possible way of thinking through that. I mean, the other answer is that as far as weighing values in a really technical sense, I mean, other people are doing really great work. Again, I think it's a sort of emerging field, but thinking through trading off, making wild welfare comparisons across different species. Mark Budolfson and others have a paper in Science from, I guess, 2023, I want to say, that sort of talks about balancing animal welfare in the animal testing context. And so making some of these trade-offs in the wildlife context could pull on that type of research. So those are some of the answers. I guess the last thing I'll just say is that the problems that you raise are real problems, but they're not completely limited to the animal context. So already agencies are making all kinds of value-based decisions when they're deciding whether to, say, allow a power plant to be built near a community that has a history of cancer, and making these kinds of decisions about effects on the economy, effects on the community. They might not be doing it well, but it is happening. So I guess my ultimate argument is, if we are going to go through the act of weighing these interests, it makes sense to include animals' interests.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, now I'm going to ask a question that came from, I counted it at least 3 times, but maybe more people have asked it by now too. And the most upvoted version comes from Carol, who notes that a lot of this discussion is focused on the individuals being harmed and killed, and maybe less on the broader social groups, their families, their packs. And so has there been any attention to the animal welfare impacts of experiencing a friend or family member or other group member being harmed and killed, these broader, more indirect social effects at the individual animal welfare level?
That's a fascinating question. And the short answer is less. It's less of a focus than focusing on just the individual animals themselves. However, there are a few instances I can think of off the top of my head from the analyses I looked at that did think about social effects. So in the wild horse context, the Bureau of Land Management goes to great lengths to explain that giving horses contraceptives is not going to change their behavior that much within their social groups, but then ultimately says, even if it does, it's still better that they be allowed to remain on the range. That's the better, more important thing. You get into some very interesting language where the Bureau of Land Management is talking about, don't worry, our stallions will still be equally wild and unruly. They just might be gelded now, but that's okay. And so that's one area where I saw it come up a lot. Outside of that area, I didn't see it so much. And it's a really good point.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So I will now interject a couple of maybe related questions of mine and then return to the list. So I am curious, first of all, if keeping in mind that this is not necessarily an audience of legal scholars, if you could say anything about the Chevron ruling and what it might imply for agency discretion around animal welfare. Does it have any effect on your analysis and your recommendations here? Maybe yes, maybe no. And semi-relatedly, I wanted to ask a little bit more about your call for agencies to be less inconsistent and hypocritical. And I was wondering if that argument that inconsistency and hypocrisy is a risk might backfire, because if agencies become convinced that this is a risk, they might decide the easier route is to be consistently neglectful of animal welfare rather than consistently thoughtful about animal welfare. So feel free to respond to either or both of those questions, but they were on my mind.
Yeah, those are great questions. So starting with Chevron, just to level set for everyone, traditionally there was this expectation in judicial evaluations of agency actions that if an agency was interpreting a statute that was somewhat ambiguous and the agency came up with a reasonable interpretation, the court would defer to the agency's interpretation so long as it was reasonable. So in this context, what that might look like is an agency saying, look, our statute doesn't say anything about whether we can or cannot consider individual animal well-being. We think it makes sense to consider individual animal well-being. And traditionally under Chevron, the court would defer to the agency's interpretation. Recently, the Supreme Court overruled Chevron, saying, no, we're not going to defer to agencies much anymore. Instead, we are going to just do the interpretive work ourselves, and we are going to decide what the best view of the statute is. So that would seem to be concerning for anyone suggesting any kind of creative use of statutory authority on the part of agencies, because it would seem that they no longer have as long a leash to interpret statutes as they see fit. I'm a little concerned in this context. I'm very concerned in other contexts. A little less concerned in this particular context, because I think probably the way that this would go is that it would probably be challenged under not a statutory context, because right now the agencies tend not to put these analyses, these environmental analyses, in really statutory terms. They tend not to say we are interpreting a part of a statute when we do this analysis. Instead, everyone sort of agrees that just the environment includes effects to all parts of the environment. And probably the likelier place they're going to get challenged is under what's called arbitrary and capricious challenge or rational challenge. And that's a different line challenge, where you just challenge an agency for being irrational, and that's different from challenging how they interpret a statute's terms. So that's the short answer to, or I don't know, medium length answer to that.
Perfect.
As for inconsistency, yes, I thought about this too. I talked about a little in some of my work. The reason I think that it's probably, I think that it would be a tough road to hoe at this point if the agencies tried to just completely stop thinking about humaneness, unless they were explicitly required by statute to think about, as they are in a couple rare instances. Partly because, I mean, they're just going to keep getting these challenges. So, and you know, they'll keep getting challenges from these animal advocates on kind of other grounds, but the reason will be in part disregard for thinking about individual animals. I think beyond that, though, it would just really be swimming upstream against a kind of powerful shared intuition a lot of us have about why we protect wild animals. And that's not even people who, you know, sit in the philosophy room and think about this. I think a lot of people, just when they think about protecting wildlife or the environment, one of the things they kind of think we're doing is trying to, you know, help out wildlife and wild animals. And so disregarding humaneness concerns, I think, would be a tough public image for the agencies to take on board.
I am inspired by your confidence that humane treatment of animals is non-negotiable in their view. I would love for that to be true, and maybe it is. Okay, great. So speaking of how they see animals, M asks whether there has been any discussion about the labeling of animals as resources in contexts involving conservation. You know, obviously, sometimes you hear we should protect animals for their own sake. Other times you hear we should safeguard this resource so that we can continue harvesting it sustainably. And perhaps these comments or these motivations are appearing in the same decisions. So in your view, has there been any effort to complicate this labeling of animals as resources? And if not, is that a problem? And is it holding back welfare efforts? What do you think?
I don't think that there's not been much of a conversation that I'm aware of, though I have had the exact same thought as the questioner, and I have similarly thought, it's awkward, they'll probably be teaching students about wild animals in a class called natural resources law. It does sort of stack the deck as far as how you're thinking about wild animals from the get-go. So I don't love it. I think it'd be great to think of other terminology for it. I'm unaware of a robust discussion, at least in the legal field, about thinking of alternative terms. So I mostly think we should try to come up with other terms. The only possible argument against it is that by calling it resources, it's a way of kind of getting this bundle of concerns into a class that's otherwise maybe sort of about, I don't know, natural gas and fossil fuel extraction. And then, because we're calling these animals resources, suddenly we also get to be teaching students about, wild animals' well-being. And so the only thing I wouldn't want is for us to, be sort of pigeonholed into a narrower place where we get excluded from some conversations because of this resistance to being included in the natural resources bucket.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So Viri asks an interesting question about whether there are general anti-cruelty laws or animal welfare acts that include the welfare of individual wild animals within their scope. Are we able to leverage any laws like that for these efforts, or no?
Yes, there are two statutes that are relevant. One is the Animal Welfare Act, which for the most part isn't interested in wild animals, but it does apply in experiments. So if you are doing a type of experiment that involves wild animals, and that could be a conservation type experiment, like, oh, we're thinking about removing one type of animal to help a forest regrow. If you describe that or characterize it as an experiment as an agency, then you have to comply with the Animal Welfare Act. So that's one way of kind of getting a hook. Again, the agencies mostly don't seem to think that the Animal Welfare Act applies, and I get why, because for the most part, they're not characterizing what they're doing as experiments. They feel pretty confident about what they're doing. They're not saying they're like doing it to learn much. There were two unexplained instances but where the National Park Service characterized what it was doing as being an experiment and therefore needing to comply with the Animal Welfare Act. So that's one thing. Another more recent law that really does apply more to animals of all kinds, including wild animals, is the PACT Act, Prevention of Animal Cruelty and Torture Act, which was had big bipartisan support. The issue here is that it has a carve out for wildlife management, hunting. So there are kind of these big categorical exclusions that make it something at least that agencies don't seem to think they have to comply with because they don't talk about it at all in their decisions that I reviewed.
Great, thank you so much. So I guess I will briefly ask a great question that comes from Ignacy and others about basically international comparative law. So this is a big topic, and obviously we can only say so much. But basically the question is about how the status quo in the US compares to the status quo elsewhere. So maybe one targeted way of asking the question for the sake of time is, are there any interesting case studies or legal frameworks in other countries that can be sources of inspiration for action in the US?
Yeah, the short answer is that this is like an area that I'm interested in thinking about more because I don't know as much about frameworks in other countries. I will say that something that could either be a challenge or an opportunity is that my understanding is that the United States is particularly into cost-benefit analysis and this kind of pseudo-utilitarian weighing of benefits and costs when taking major regulatory actions, and that is less common in, say, Europe. That can in some ways make it easier for us in the United States, in that it makes it a bit easier for us to like throw another value into the bucket of things that we're considering. On the other hand, it does put some pressure on kind of monetizing any given issue that we're concerned about, and it does make it, I think we're more hesitant in the US to extend rights generally, not only to animals, but to humans as well, because they tend to be thought of as something that's close to absolute here in a way that's not the case in much of the rest of the world. So my thought is that it could be useful to kind of borrow some of these, more sort of relativistic approach to rights that the rest of the world has. But I need to think about that more.
That's a great answer. I think that would be worth exploring more. Yeah, thank you very much for that. Okay, since we're about out of time, I am now going to close by asking a question that once again several people have asked, and there's always a good final question to ask, which is, what can we do? So one person asked whether your recommendations have reached any agency actors and maybe influenced them, and another person asked, how can these recommendations reach agency actors to influence them, and what can we do to help make that the case? So as a final question, please tell us how we can help.
That's a great question. I think that a good way to try, I mean, obviously, if you know wildlife managers and you're talking to them, it's great to float your ideas, including the ideas I put forward. So one thing I'm trying to do is just get to know some wildlife managers more and sort of understand how they think and what the issues on the ground are. But what people can do is generally, whenever a regulation, including these kinds of removals, are being considered, the agency puts out a call for comments, and anyone is allowed to submit a comment. And the more sort of technical and kind of tied to law and policy your comment is, the better a chance you have of the agency considering it a significant or substantial comment. And then the agency is required by law to respond. And if it doesn't respond, then that's a grounds for challenging it in court. So I think to the extent you find any of these suggestions useful, it's something worth highlighting to the agency in comments that you can just put online. If you just like Google kind of regulations.gov, that's a decent place to find calls for comments.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. We still have lots and lots of questions, and apologies to everyone for not getting to them all. But as I said, we will share them with Natalie so she can at least see them, even though she will not be able to reply to them. So let me just close by saying, Natalie, thank you so much again for doing this research and for sharing it with us today. This was just fantastic, and we really appreciate it. And I know everybody got a lot out of it. And everybody, please do continue to follow Natalie's research. And then I will also just say that as a reminder, this talk was hosted by the NYU Wild Animal Welfare Program. We do have an ongoing online public speaker series, as well as occasional in-person events. So if you are interested in more talks along these lines on a wide range of topics, please sign up for the email list. You can find it on our website. Our partner program, the Center for Mind Ethics and Policy, will also be hosting the US launch of Jonathan Birch's book, The Edge of Sentience. That will take place both in person and online on November 11th. So please check out the Mind Ethics and Policy website and sign up for that email list as well if you have interest in attending that event or other events on similar topics. And with that all in mind, thanks again to Natalie and to Sophia also for organizing, and Becca for co-hosting, and for everybody for attending. We really do appreciate it.